after 10 minutes, I will intervene just to let the speakers know that we've had 10 minutes. I'm not wanting to cut anybody off prematurely, but just so that we can keep a hold of the time. And then we obviously have a number of senior colleagues with us who will then want to contribute after that. So obviously the context in which we're meeting is also the city region itself having produced in consultation with many of us its own economic plans. So Aileen will talk to that. So whether people's contributions are on the general economic picture or on the city region specific plans, hopefully we've got colleagues here who are able to answer those questions. So that said, if I can invite Erica and Joe to talk about the one-day report, first of all.
Hi everyone, lovely to see you all on, so many people on a Zoom call. I hope you can all hear me okay. So we're here today to talk about the work that we've done on one day, a Liverpool City Region Industrial Strategy position statement designed by women for the prosperity of all. My name's Councillor Joanne Anderson, and I'll just hand over to Erica to introduce herself a moment.
Hi, yeah, my name's Erica Rushton, and I think it was a tweet of mine that initially brought the people together, an infuriated tweet.
For me, absolutely, as per the chat, they need supporting more than ever, and I think...
Sorry, sorry, there was a bit of an interruption there. I wasn't sure what was happening. Yeah, so and I did until recently chair Baltic Creative, which some of you will know, down in the Baltic Triangle. I'm currently working on a project called Kindred to support socially trading organisations across the city region, and I do a little bit of work across the Northwest. Feminism is my hobby.
Next slide, please, Olivia. So this is a little question that at the end of our presentation we'll let you try and think of the answer. So that's just a question we'll come back to. If you go to the next slide, Olivia. Okay, so tweet started by Erica. What was wonderful was a diverse range of women participated and responded to the tweet. We met one day at the women's organisation. Alison was also one of the participants, as was Fiona, myself and Erica. We represented a lot of different sectors. One of the stats coming out that I'm not too impressed by, we had 1,000 years lived experience, which showed how old we were perhaps in the room. But we donated one day of our time to look at the Liverpool City Region Industrial Strategy through a gendered lens. Coming to COVID and what's happened, we recognise that the world that we discussed that we wanted to have gender equality was something that is really relevant as part of this crisis. Our work is supported by not just local but global evidence. Next slide, please, Olivia. So the report that is published on the Liverpool City Region website talks about a number of different areas, about diversity, about care sector, creativity, social and circular economy and safety. But to keep it brief today, we're going to talk about diversity and the care sector.
Okay, next slide, please. And I think probably what's important is the first thing that the women who came together on that day was they threw out industry sectors. We realised that for us as women, to gather around industry sectors, we were always going to be left in the margins. And so those 6 priorities that Joe put up, what we decided we would gather our thoughts and our strengths around. So I'll talk about diversity and care, just to give you an example of where we got to on that day, and we'll put a link for the full document in the chat before we finish. So in terms of our evidence, there's lots of references we can give you as to where it comes from, but it's not from one source. Globally now, 60% of new growth is coming from women. And when the policy framework is in place, that increases to 80%. Other evidence suggests that Moving from an all-male to a gender-balanced leadership team will boost revenues by up to 41%, but a minimum of around 13-14. And a gender-balanced leadership team, on average, is 15% more profitable and much less likely to go bust than an all-male team. So we're not talking about fairness today, we're talking about an economic imperative that the region does well, a responsibility that sits with the combined authority. At the moment, though, the UK is going backwards and has been for about 13 years. On the current sort of trajectory, it'll take 202 years to achieve gender parity, so don't hope for it for your children. Economic participation and opportunity, we've gone from 37th to 52nd. Educational attainment from 1st to 38th. Health and survival, we're right down at 110th. And in the Liverpool City region, this is it is the 3rd worst place in the UK to live if you're part of some of the black and racial minority groups. So we're asking Liverpool City region to be a conditional investor. If you are going to put public money into things, we would ask you take the line from Legal and General as one example, who will now only invest in things that have at least 30% women on the leadership team. And we would suggest you set a target to move up from that leadership to 50%. You had to back me back from 75%, because unless there is a majority of women in the room, women are not heard. Again, research evidence to support that. We would also ask you to ask anybody you invest in to participate in positive action. There is a peak in Liverpool when black people began to get a better percentage of the jobs. And that peak coincides with when Liverpool City Council ran its positive action programme. And we're not talking about the crumbs here. We don't mean positive action at the bottom of an organisation. We don't support what's called the deficit model. There is nothing lacking in women or black people that requires them to get more training or more mentoring. They are more qualified than most white men in the region in every industry sector. And we would say, no, this is about removing the structural barriers within organisations and requiring as a condition of your investment and your support that they put those people in those places as a matter of course, until balance is achieved, of course. We did when we were thinking of all this before coronavirus, want the Liverpool City region to be the first place in the UK to harness diversity as an economic driver. Manchester's pipped us to the post. They've set something up in the last month, led by Councillor Eve Holt, who's done an amazing job there, and we congratulate and welcome them, but we will be asking you to do something similar. Next slide, please. So just to touch on care, and again, we're talking about this, remember, pre-coronavirus. The things we were looking at then have only been highlighted. So the Northwest is home to 21% of the UK's chemical and pharmaceutical production. It accounts for an awful lot of jobs and an awful lot of money. And the National Health Service buys an awful lot of what they produce. That's a national figure, 7 billion every year they spend on drugs. But of those drugs, 80% are only tested on men. Medicines known to continually harm women continue to be sold and bought by our NHS with public money. Black and minority women don't even get a fair share of those harming drugs or not harming drugs. They're 50% less likely to be given pain relief drugs. They're 4 times more likely than white women, than me, to die in childbirth. This is not an equal healthcare system. So yes, let's save the NHS. Yes, let's make sure that people have good health, but let's make sure it works for everybody as we build back better. In terms of pre-COVID, it was glaringly apparent from Liverpool City Region's position statement that actually it is health that holds us back on productivity more than anything else. If we could remove the barriers to health and be a cared for and caring region where we care for ourselves, each other, and those that need the support, we would move a long way to productivity. And the Women's Budget Group have demonstrated across 7 countries, including the UK, that investment in care delivers a better return than investment in construction for everybody, men and women. And there's some figures there to say what that could achieve. So we're asking you not to procure or invest in organisations that only test their drugs on men, because you are investing in harm to women. We ask you to recognise care as a high value contributor to the region's productivity, and perhaps set a pay benchmark. What is it we think that care workers are worth? And let's set that as a benchmark and invite everybody to leap that high. And finally, to move to invest as much in care and the care sectors as you are currently proposing to invest in construction in the recovery plan. Back to you, Jo. Next slide.
Okay, so if you could just put the answers in the chat to the initial question of how we could improve, sorry, let me find the initial question. How do we increase the region's growth by 35% each year at no additional cost? And just to go over our specific asks again. We've tried over the last 3 years in various different guises, from the Women's Leadership Group to the one-day report, to raise the issue of the lack of gender representation in the devolved authorities. We ask you to do something about it. You know, do we need to go back to the devolution deal? We've got fantastic examples of effective women leadership throughout the crisis, and the fact that devolution only deliver 4% of women as part of as Metro mayors is really quite worrying. And for you as MPs, we'd like you to think about that and go back and try to do something about it. In terms of the recovery plan, asking for the 30% within investments that are made in terms of 30% of women in the leadership team, you know, it's a fact that that leads to better productivity and a no-brainer as far as we're concerned. As Erica mentioned the statistic before, that recovery investment for new growth, 80% globally comes from women, and surely, again, that's a no-brainer that we need to ensure gender equality in order for that to happen. And finally, we are Manchester's equivalent of the gender initiative that they've got in place. For 3 years, we've tried in all manner of different ways to raise the profile of gender equality within the region. I'm sure we started off nicely, and then we got a bit angry, and then we asked publicly, and then we asked privately. And I think our one-day example is now we've shown what is required. This is, we've got together, we've done the work, we've looked at the industrial strategy, and we've clearly outlined what gender equality means from women who want equality for all. So we've asked those specific asks for you, and you just need to catch up that we are already in existence. You're the same as Manchester's Equality Initiative, so we'd like you to formally recognise that as well. Thank you. Oh, sorry, the answer to the question is, of course, investing in women. That's where you get 35% growth at no extra cost. Thank you.
Okay, that's brilliant. And on to Sue Jarvis. Sue, talk us through the Heseltine Institute work. Okay,
thanks, Alison. Good afternoon, everybody. I've been at the Heseltine Institute now for the past year, but as a number of you all know, before that I worked in the Combined Authority, and before that at Knowsley Council, so very much steeped in the Liverpool City region agenda. In terms of our policy briefs, if you can turn to the next slide, please. We launched these briefings in April to respond to the pandemic in terms of its immediate impacts, but also to stimulate ideas in the city region to support the decision makers in terms of how to develop strategies to build back better. And from the outset, it was really important to us to make sure that we were adding value through the briefings. So we've worked very closely with policymakers and academics in the city region to make sure that we're making sure we're working on the right topics. Next slide, please. This slide just really is intended to give you a flavour of the wide range of policy areas that have been covered We've had 18 briefings to date, and some of these have been practitioner-led, while other ones are offering much more blue sky thinking about how to create a more resilient Liverpool City region. And I just want to give you a few examples of some of the topics. So one of the earlier briefings that we undertook was about universal basic income. And this considered the potential of UBI both as an immediate response to the crisis, but also as a more permanent policy solution to a number of wider problems, from rising poverty and inequality to the transition to a more automated economy with fewer jobs. Another briefing looked at the implications of COVID on care homes and made a number of recommendations which, if implemented, it argued would make the lives of older people living in care homes better, but also importantly, reduce the impact of any future infectious outbreaks. And another example from an economic recovery perspective is written by one of the people on the call today, Professor Michael Parkinson, whose briefing after COVID-19, is Liverpool still beyond the brink or back on the brink, posed a number of questions and answered a range of questions that were around, is Liverpool back on the brink of disaster as in the 1980s? What damage has the crisis done to the key drivers of our economy? And are there any benefits to be taken from the experience of the pandemic? And what will the recovery look like? Next slide, please. So a number of the policy briefs are making the case for new ways of working and very much how we respond to the opportunities to build back better. The transitioning towards a 4-day week briefing is a good example of this. And this briefing argued that a shorter working week of 4 days could help the UK economy transition in the wake of the pandemic in a way that brings positive health and well-being benefits, but also promotes greater gender equality and environmental benefits. Another briefing that was produced on active travel looked at how walking and cycling were a good solution to keep the city region moving. And this was particularly important in the early stages of the pandemic when the public transport network was needing to operate and still is on that reduced capacity due to social distancing. The series of briefings have also highlighted where potential shifts in policy might now be more acceptable from a political perspective and what's called the Overton window. And a good example of this is the work that's been going on in terms of a green and resilient recovery. And what we've been able to do through one of the briefings is take a look at the experience of Amsterdam, which was the first city to publish its recovery plan. And it used the donut economics model as a guide to the post-COVID-19 recovery. And what we've done is taken that concept and created the Liverpool City Region Donut, which outlines some practical steps that the city region could take if it used this donut model as part of its recovery planning. So a number of useful ideas are sort of out there for the policymakers to take a look at. What we've also been able to do through the series is really think about future devolution and what does that mean for the city region, and really to try and make the case that devolution settlements in the future must be used to empower city regions as the engines for the social and economic recovery. Next slide, please. So, having reviewed all 18 policy briefings to date, there are a number of common themes that are emerging from them that do have implications for the recovery planning. And I think firstly, I wanted to highlight the importance of local place-based leadership in terms of delivering a coordinated approach. And we've got some good examples through a number of the briefs to show where that has been happening in this city region. It's also important that we harness the increased connectivity of people with their local communities. And again, this has been a strong message in terms of how the Liverpool City region and other areas have been responding to the pandemic. And some of our briefings that we've included look at food security, what's been happening in the city region, but also looking at things like grassroots football and the implications of COVID-19 on how that should be moving forward. And thirdly, one of the key messages is that policy problems are complex problems, and they do require evidence and insights from a range of disciplines if they are to be most effective. So next slide, please. So just really in terms of summing up and where next for us with the policy briefings, we still have a future pipeline, and we've got some international practice from China, Singapore and New Zealand, where we're hoping to learn some of the lessons from what these cities have been doing to reopen. We've got a new policy briefing due in the next week or so that considers the impact of COVID-19 on BAME communities and looks at the city region to draw in some examples. Another one, working with the local museums, considers the role of culture, museums and soft power initiatives as part of the recovery. And for us at the Heseltine Institute, it's important that we evaluate and measure the impact of this work because we want it to remain relevant. We want to be able to respond to changing real-time needs and priorities, so we know we need to remain flexible in our approach. And we also need to continue to work with the Combined Authority and other partners in the city region to support that economic recovery planning process. So a number of options are on the table, whether we need to look at how we address data gaps so that we can remain relevant and deal with some of the challenges that we know we're going to have to face in the coming years. And this may mean looking at new areas of research that can then translate into the policy-making machinery. So to sum up, I would say the feedback we've had so far from the policy-making community and within the university has been positive, and we've been able to broker some new networks through this series. So as I've said, we intend to continue with the briefings as long as people want them, and hopefully get some feedback from yourselves at a later date. So thank you.
Thanks, Sue. That was absolutely brilliant. Just one quick thought from me is that we possibly might be able to have some, a regular feature of experts from the Heseltine Institute at these APPG meetings as we go forward and new briefings are created. I think it would make sense to have a regular reoccurring slot for the Heseltine Institute. So if you would let your colleagues know that, we can
happy to.
liaise.
Yeah.
We can liaise on that point. And next, Aileen Jones. Aileen, it will not be possible for her to encompass all of the very extensive work in 10 minutes as to what has gone into the economic development plan, but I know that you will do your best to give people an overview. Aileen.
Thank you, Alison. This is just a snapshot of the recovery plan. And I'm going to try and do three things in the next 10 minutes. Just say a little bit about the economic impact of COVID in the city region, on our people and our businesses. Secondly, just to talk through where the recovery plan is going. What is the CA's role in the recovery? What are the main themes of the economic recovery plan? And we have four main themes, and I'll talk you through those. Next slide, please. Thanks, Olivia. Before the pandemic hit, the Combined Authority were working on a local industrial strategy, and Eric and Joanne have talked about it this morning, for the city region, which set out the vision for the economy over the next 20 years. And our vision is about transforming together, delivering a globally competitive, environmentally sustainable and inclusive economy. The vision captures the opportunity we identified for transformational change across our economy and how this change must be delivered together, working with our people, stakeholders, local authorities and government. COVID is already having an unprecedented change in our economy and the way that we live and work. But despite these changes, we think our vision remains valid. And in fact, we think it's probably more relevant now in light of the impacts of COVID. Next slide, please. So just to give you a flavour of the impact that COVID has had on the city region economy, we expect our economy to be disproportionately affected by the pandemic, and there's a number of reasons for that, but the sectoral composition of the city region gives a good indication of how we're impacted. Many of the sectors that are concentrated in the city region, such as education and manufacturing, have been some of the hardest hit. So if you look on the bottom right quadrant, the size of the bubble reflects the size of the sector. So you can see like education, manufacturing have been hit, and the visitor economy, etc., have been hit significantly harder in the city region because they make up the sectoral composition and a larger share of our economy. Next slide, please. We've already seen significant impacts on our businesses and our people. Nearly all businesses in the city region report have been impacted negatively in the first few weeks of lockdown. We know our universal credit claim rate increased by 65% between February and May, equating to an extra 62,000 people claiming universal credit. And job vacancies have declined significantly in the city region. They're down 49% compared to pre-lockdown. Next slide, please. So the scale of the challenge we face is huge in the city region, and the cost of recovery measures has already exceeded 1 billion in the city region alone. Given the scale of the challenge we face, national measures and national intervention by government must lead the recovery. That said, given the specific challenges that we face in the city region, there is a real need for further devolved funding so that we can tackle some of those very particular and specific challenges, both in terms of our business space and our people in the city region, that require local intervention and not a national programme. Next slide, please. So, accepting that we can't resolve every problem, we have to focus on where the combined authority can add the most value to the economic recovery efforts of the whole city region. The CA's role in recovery is based around 3 key principles. The first is we need to be able to inform and influence the national recovery package to best fit our city region and its residents. Secondly, where needed, we should provide local delivery of recovery programmes, which I touched on. And thirdly, we need to use our devolved funding and powers to continue to deliver existing programmes, as well as new projects to lead the recovery effort. Next slide, please. As Alison said, I'm just going to give you a flavour of the economic recovery plan and the 4 main themes. The plan itself is built around the overarching principle that the recovery is an opportunity to build back better. And it has 4 key strands, and I'll talk you through just at a high level each of the strands now. The first is the business ecosystem. Secondly, we need a people-focused recovery. Thirdly, we need place interventions. And fourthly, a green recovery, and what types of interventions do we need to achieve a green recovery. If we just take, next slide please, Sylvia. If we take the business ecosystem first, we want to deliver a step change in how we facilitate business growth and create a more dynamic and innovative business ecosystem in the city region. Our recovery plan puts forward 4 key components to achieve this. Firstly, local finance provision built on an in-depth understanding of the local gaps that exist in our business space and where the real need is for our businesses that isn't captured in the national programmes. Secondly, improving access to good quality advice on finance and resilience, peer-to-peer support, and both domestic and global market development for our businesses. Thirdly, facilitating access to our already significant array of innovation assets, as well as investing to grow our research and development infrastructure further. Our evidence base tells us that we're not making the most of the assets that we have in the city region, and we're not connecting our assets with the real research strengths that we have at our local universities, and we need to commercialise more on those research strengths. And finally, network development that will enhance the effectiveness of the ecosystem by promoting knowledge sharing across the city region's business space. These will be complemented by a series of ambitious economic infrastructure projects, and we have a number of projects that we have set out in our local recovery plan that need investment, and they include things like the National Packaging Innovation Centre, Health Innovation Liverpool, as well as investment in SciTech Daresbury, the Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine. Taking our second theme of the recovery plan, people-focused recovery, our plan seeks to protect the gains that we've made in employment and growth in the city region before the pandemic. We plan to propose to work in partnership with government and our stakeholders across the national programmes that they are looking at on skills training, apprenticeships and school catch-up to ensure they're well coordinated and promoted locally. We also need a number of local interventions, and we need to put in place interventions that complement the national response and add the most value for the people of the city region. I'll just give you a flavour of some of the local interventions that we're thinking about. We feel we need a sustainable job creation programme that will work with businesses to create jobs for those over 25 who will not be able to benefit from the government's Kickstart programme. We also want an expansion of our Pioneering Ways to Work programme that provides individual targeted support for unemployed people. We want a pilot programme working with employers to deliver organisational change to improve the health and well-being of employees. And we need a reskill and retrain programme to further improve our skills base in the city region, which is still a challenge for us. Next slide, please. The third theme, is place, and we need a number of place-related interventions in the city region. It's really important when you're trying to understand the impact of COVID. Our deprived neighbourhoods and towns have been hardest hit by the pandemic, and areas that rely on the visitor economy for employment and growth have seen significant economic impacts. During recovery, we need to support these areas in order to build back better and invest in our cultural offer that not only provides employment but also helps to bind communities together. The recovery plan puts forward a number of interventions to do this, and this is just a flavour of some of them. It's not all of our inventions, but they include working with government to increase the funding for the Towns Fund and to expand to include other towns like Highton and Visual. It includes things like investing in a cultural programme that promotes community cohesion with creative responses to issues around diversity, loneliness and mental health and other health problems that we have in the city region like obesity. It includes a package to stimulate further house building in the city region and provide new affordable homes. Also includes an intervention to expand Liverpool's International Slavery Museum, which is made all the more important given recent global events associated with the Black Lives Matter movement. Fourthly, our green recovery. We are really well placed in the city region to respond to the current crisis with a green recovery and push forward our ambitious plan to be carbon neutral by 2040. The city region is home to key green economic assets and unique opportunities in the low carbon sector. The largest project we have within the Green Recovery Strand is the Mersey Tidal Power Programme. It's a multi-billion-pound project. It has the potential to generate huge amounts of clean energy and significant economic benefits for the city region. Our plan also seeks to invest in retrofitting our housing stock, providing jobs, as well as reducing emissions and tackling fuel poverty. Included also is the Liverpool City Region Hydrogen Economy Programme that builds on our strategic advantages in the sector. Those are a very quick, high-level view of some of the interventions under each of the key themes in the recovery. I'm conscious that there's a lot of detail that sits beside that, and we'd be happy to share the current draft of the recovery plan with you after the event today. Thank you.
Thanks, Aileen. That was actually brilliantly done, and all our speakers were to time, which is excellent. Thank you for that. I'll bring in Mayor Steve Rotherham now, just to Steve, just for any reflections that you have just briefly on the economic strategy moving forward. And I know you are also looking for support from colleagues as well on different elements of it. So perhaps if you would say a few words, and then otherwise if people can indicate in the chat if they've got questions or they would like to make a very short contribution.
Thanks, Chair. Most of what I need to say has been brilliantly said by Aileen. Look, we've submitted today our plan to government, and Aileen's outlined that it's a roadmap, it's a blueprint for us by which we can identify opportunities to work closely with government so that we can get investable projects locally delivered at an accelerated timescale. And all of those things are what government want to do. So we're buying something that they've told us that they're selling, which I think is the right way to go around things. But it doesn't mean to say that we go back to where we were 4 months ago. And we do, and you've heard it from, I think, everybody who spoke, we do have to build back better. And look, whilst that's not a new terminology, it's been going around for many years. Myself and Andy Burnham commandeered it because we were worried about the government talking about bouncing back. And we don't want to bounce back. We want to get back to where we need to get to economically, but we need a different economic model, and we can do things differently and we can do things better. So that was the idea around it. And on the Devo issue, it's great that Lord Michael Heseltine's on the call as well. He did something probably 2 years ago called Empowering English Cities, and there were about 20 recommendations in that. And yet the government still haven't acted to implement many of those recommendations. And I'd say to the parliamentarians to look at that afresh, because if we do want to build back better, not just in the Liverpool City region, but we also need to ensure that that is rolled out much more widely, Chair. So for me, opportunity to reset the dial. There's some really good stuff that we're doing. I think when people present, sometimes they forget to highlight just where the Liverpool City region is leading on many of these issues. And we're doing really well. Do we need to do more? Of course we do. And we can do things even better than we currently are. But believe me, from where we started, for instance, the first in the whole country to have something which is a Fairness and Social Justice Advisory Board headed up by Lynn Collins, that was unique, that was new. And many of the ideas and the suggestions that have stemmed from discussions with things that 3.5 years ago we started to address. So, credit sometimes where credit's due. What I think Build Back Better is, it's not just about an economic model though, because if we just purely think about this about in financial and monetary terms, we'll lose the thread of what we can do. So I'll give you I'll give you a few examples, Chair. In this COVID pandemic period, the government implemented something which meant that there was a roof over everyone's head. That should be something that's continued afterwards. The social agenda is really important, and we need, for instance, to continue the process by which we can look to support people who are out of work instead of the sanctions first approach. And that is something that we need to continue because sanctions are coming back, unfortunately. We stopped evictions for people, especially those who were caught in the poverty trap because universal credit payments hadn't been made. Why are we allowing landlords to go back to some bad practices when we can build back better? There are lots and lots of things around active travel, etc., that I could go on to. Even the fact that there's been recognition at long last of our minimum wage heroes, those people in care, adult social care especially, who've been doing fantastic work for decades, and yet it's taken a pandemic for people to really understand that. Or our cleaners who are integral to even the most skilled brain surgeon in the whole country being able to do his or her job. and we've got people who have been undervalued and certainly underpaid, and hopefully out of this we will see some recognition. Many of those, of course, those people in those lower paid jobs are women and people from black and minority ethnic groups as well, so that would be good. But there's a whole list that I can provide, Chair, in regard to what our approach will be, but it will be inclusive and it will be different.
Okay, that's brilliant, Steve. Thank you for that. I'll bring in Lord Heseltine, who'd indicated through the Secretariat that he would contribute, but unfortunately has to go relatively shortly. So I'll bring in Lord Heseltine, and then we've got Joanne, and Kim's just put a comment in the chat box, so she may be able to come in as well. Lord Heseltine.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Okay, good. Yes, I'm not on top of this whiz kidry in the way that some of you are. Look, this is a fascinating experience for me, because my very deep memories of Liverpool, of course, belong in 1981, when I was able to spend 3 weeks walking the streets in another moment of crisis. The interesting thing at that time is that everybody knew what was wrong, and it was always somebody else. It was never me, it was always them. And the one thing that absolutely stuck me in the face is that there was no one in charge, and there were no ideas locally as to what should be done about what was then a very serious situation. The thing about this particular meeting now today is the abundance of ideas locally from people, and I'm sure you could replicate this in other sectors, the academic world, the industrial and commercial world, and you get another great feast of ideas. That's a huge starting point. Second point is that a few months ago, Liverpool and its environs was undergoing a recovery economically of a scale that I had never seen, and of course found immensely exciting. The fact remains that we have two crises: COVID, which has delivered a body blow to many, many people and to the economy at large. But we also have a Brexit crisis, which in some ways, structurally, is likely to have a greater effect. And so these two coming together face this country and of course the great cities with a challenge of unprecedented scale. Now, for me, the single most important thing that has happened today is that you've got Steve sitting listening to all of this as the elected mayor of the Conurbation Authority. And here I have a sad thing to say, because I was involved in a privileged position as an advisor to the government a few years ago when George Osborne was getting a grip on the Treasury and pushing the devolution agenda. I was very lucky to be a special advisor to Greg Clark, who was also pushing the devolution agenda. And I myself had the privilege of producing for the 6 mayors, as they were then, Steve one of them, the report he mentioned called Empowering English Cities, which I believe was the agenda for devolution. Why am I sad? Frankly, I think the steam has gone out of devolution. We've had in the course of the last month, big statement from the Prime Minister and then the Chancellor, and the ideas to create devolution just weren't mentioned. And all my feedback from friends and colleagues is that there is no momentum in government. And so Steve is, in my view, in the position of the mayoral leader to create the opportunities that all of you want to have explored, and a huge range of others, to try and use the money, huge amounts of money that the government is talking about, in a way that reflects the talents, the energies, the strengths, and the opportunities of the Greater Merseyside area. He's alone in that position, but he is not being given the chance. I'm fascinated to hear, Steve, you've sent in a report today, and perhaps somebody would be kind enough to send me a copy of it. But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe the government will turn around and say, Steve, we're with you. Here we go. Let's get on with it. But my observation tells me that we're back with the same old technique of Whitehall's separate departments coming up with separate schemes, putting sticking plasters on the particular problem of their department, and without any real attempt to say to local people, look, what's the problem? How are we going to deal with it? What do you think should happen? And what are you prepared to do to help if we can help as well? I don't see any of that. And that is extraordinarily sad. And I hope perhaps if I could widen what I'm saying to the members of Parliament, this is something you can do something about. You, in the end, have a voice. And you now have, I think, 9 conurbation mayors, something like that. But anyway, there are certainly a significant number. And if the members of Parliament for those areas, and it's cross-party, don't think this is a party political point. There are Labour mayors, there are Tory mayors. If their members of Parliament get together and say to the government, we are determined that you treat us like Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. Why should the economy of Merseyside or Manchester, which are in the same league with Scotland and Wales, why should they be run from the fiat of Whitehall's departments when we have devolved authorities in those 3 places? I can't understand it. And I certainly can't understand that across the world, the model of economic and social improvement is the mayoral model. Why don't we make it work here? I've only one last thing to say, and it's a specific point about the Slavery Museum. I think this is a brilliant idea. And I've talked to Joe Anderson about this when I was last on Merseyside, because there's a site alongside the Slavery Museum as it is today, and it's a dock. So why not build a model of those appalling ships that did those appalling things? It would be, in my view, hugely educational, but it would also be a very considerable feature of the cultural tourist boost upon which Mersey is, in my view, likely to be well placed. So thank you for listening to me. I'm an honorary Scouser, I suppose I can say. You've made me a freedom of the city, which was one of the most moving things that ever happened to me. But you're the local people, you're the ones I want to empower. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lord Heseltine. Joe had a question on Aileen's presentation. So if I bring in Joe briefly, other people have put contributions in the chat box, which is really useful. And I wondered, Kim, if you wanted to come in on your question. Lynn Collins has put a response as well. But if colleagues could just indicate if they would like to contribute, that would be really useful. And I'll also watch out for people waving. But Joe, did you want to ask your question briefly?
Yeah, I have 2 questions, sorry. So the first one, community cohesion is really important and a basic right for people to have safety within their own communities. And international slavery, there is plans to do more at the dock. They've just received funding. I've been working with the Liverpool International Slavery Museum. But in discussions with them, the difference that makes to people's lives, particularly Black people's lives, is having a job. So I think it's in the gift within the Liverpool City region to develop a positive action strategy. If we just look at how apprenticeship money is spent alone, that there's not enough done to increase diversity right throughout the apprenticeship structure. I don't even think we have the data, which isn't great. So I would like to see something much more hard-hitting that would make a positive impact to people's lives, like positive action, because actually having a job is really important for economic progress. In terms of the Fairness and Social Justice Board, I'm just not aware of any outcomes from that activity for the last 3 years that it's been in place. And I don't know whether information's been published or it's put out there. And, you know, Steve, I welcome that it was the first in the country and that, you know, there was a dedicated resource talking about fairness. It's just, as somebody who works equality in the region, I just don't know the impact of that.
Thanks, Joe. If I take the first question,
Thanks, Amy.
and then we can also answer in the Fairness and Social Justice Board. Look, your point's really well made and valid. I should say that this document is a live document, Joanne, so this is the beginning of the process. There is, you know, huge potential to reposition, add more, because we still don't have clarity on what the national framework for recovery is going to look like. So I think it's really important that we are in listening mode now. This is the start of the process. What else do you think needs to be? We are in that space. We really want to listen. I hear you on positive action. We've just actually, Lorna Rogers is working on an internal and external program of work on this specifically. We've actually just commissioned internally a note on positive action. So it'd be really good to talk to you about that work as it progresses, and what do we need to see in recovery that is more hard hitting to hit the point that you have made, for example, on apprenticeship. So I'd be really grateful for the conversation actually as that work develops, and you may have already had a conversation with Lorna, but it would be really good to follow that up. I know Lynn is on in the Fairness and Social Justice Board. We do publish, I think, the minutes of the meeting. I know we've done a review of the board, and Lynn might want to say more on that.
Thanks, Aileen. Kim Johnson, did you want to come in, because you'd asked the question about equality and diversity policies in the chat?
Yeah, well, I had a couple of questions to a couple of people. One of them was the Fair Employment Charter that was launched whenever it was. I raised some issues when that was first published. Don't know where it's up to, so it would be good to find out where that's up to. Also, in terms of the Fairness and Justice Board, there was a meeting held on Tuesday, equality through a BME lens. I had lots of emails complaining that people had been invited. So there are some issues in terms of how information is disseminated. Erica mentioned about women aren't in the room, we don't hear those voices. I think it is exactly the same for Black people, and I noticed in terms of the photograph from the event, there was only one Black woman. And lastly, I think it was Sue that mentioned something about looking at the impact of COVID-19 on Black people. So I'd like to hear a bit more about that, given that the government commissioned the report from PHE. That didn't say an awful lot. But what I'd finally say is that the time for listening and talking is done. We know what needs to happen in terms of improving equality of opportunity for Black people, and that is to give them jobs. I've recently been seeking evidence from schools, from health, about their employment of Black people. It's so damning, you know, so damning. So it's about, you know, actions speak louder than words, and let's get something done finally. Thanks.
Thanks. Well, let's bring in Lynn Collins just on the Fast Job and the Fair Employment Charter. And if anybody else has questions or points, do please indicate.
Hi, thanks, Alison. Yeah, just I put an update in the chat about the Fair Employment Charter. So we had some initial consultation earlier in the year, just before lockdown. We're just about to restart the process of designing the charter based on the input to that consultation and to the formal exercise, with an aim to go back out with a draft charter in the autumn and launch in January 2021. So within that charter, one of the streams is about inclusive employment, and within that stream, obviously, that's where we would build in all our equality and diversity factors and measures that we want to hold employers to account over. So really useful. Any input people want to have into that process, do just get in touch. In terms of FasJab launched about 2 years ago, and after about a year's operation, we did a 1-year review of it. We launched at a time when the Combined Authority was a much smaller organisation with very limited resources. And over the last year since we've had the review, one of our aims is to garner some more resources so that the work of FASJAB can be raised up onto a different level. So we're now looking at policy, research resources, and engaging with our engagement team who work with communities to make sure that the work is much more outward facing. So again, really welcome people's views about how we can best do that in the future. We're just out at the moment to recruit to the vacant spaces on FASJAB. So again, if anyone needs any information about that, do get in touch. We've always been pretty good in terms of gender balance. More than 50% of the members were women. I think we had 6 out of 14 members from BAME backgrounds, but we can always do better on those things, can't we? So if there is an opportunity for people to circulate that round networks, please just get in touch and we'll let you have the information.
Fantastic, thanks, Lynn. Obviously, one of the points of these meetings is so that people can get to know who's doing what and then pick up practical work outside the meetings. So I'm sure that colleagues will do that. I've got Helen Heap from CBOM Hill and Damien Waters from the CBI next. Helen.
Hi there, thank you. I've put quite a long post on the chat with some points about social care, and I should just, in the interest of full disclosure, make a point that I'm a trustee of Local Solutions, which is one of the larger care providers across Liverpool City region. But just picking up on some of the things we said, so just about the importance of the care sector to women. So official industry stats that come from one of the industry bodies show that 84% of the care workers in domiciliary care across Liverpool City region are women. 50% of the care workers in domiciliary care across Liverpool City region are on 0 hours contracts. But that actually varies a lot across the different boroughs. So a couple of boroughs only have 27% of 0 hours contracts. One of the boroughs has 76% of their domiciliary care contracts are 0 hours contracts. So first point to make is there is a lot of variation across the city region on things like employment practices, and that also applies to the rates that are paid for domiciliary care across the region. So if, as a city region, we are wanting to become an exemplar of best practice in employment, in working conditions, etc., then there's some work to be done to just level up across the region between the different boroughs. So I guess the question that I have is, first of all, are the MPs that are on the call aware that there is quite a lot of variation across the conditions, pay and conditions in social care? And if not, then please, I'll be happy to provide some proper information that is official information. And then following on from that, how can we bring everybody up to best standards? There's an awful lot that needs to be done on training as well. Domiciliary care, if you're providing 15-minute contracts or 15-minute sessions for people, and you're paying minimum wage for that, there is absolutely no scope for people to be trained adequately on those sort of arrangements, and that is a big problem for the sector. It's a big problem for women because they are so heavily involved in the sector. So as Erica and Joe said right at the start, if we were to invest properly in our care sector, then we could make a massive difference to a lot of people very, very quickly. And so my question is, what do we need to do? How can we all work together to make sure that we are best practice across the city region in all of our boroughs and all of our contracts?
That's a really fantastic point, Helen. Damien from Paula Barker MP's team has just made a point in the chat that Paula's aware, and I think a lot of us would be quite aware, but I think that it would be really good if you wouldn't mind, Helen, if you want to send me an email, and then I will circulate it to all the Merseyside MPs with that information. Sure. And any further things that you want to draw our attention to, I think that would be very useful. To another Damien Waters from the CBI. Damien, you wanted to comment?
not very often I'm on a call and there's another Damien involved, so that's quite nice to see. Yeah, so it was a quick question. I mentioned in the chat, we've kind of welcomed and endorsed the recovery plan. And it does identify some of the issues kind of facing the BAME communities, but there's not very much in there about the strategies to support those communities. And I wondered in the implementation plan, whether that would be drawn out more specifically. In the recovery plan, it talks about a specific fund, but it ties that up also with people who have disabilities. So just wondered whether kind of a strategy for recovery for BAME communities would be a specific element of the implementation plan after this recovery plan is accepted.
Aileen, I think that's kind of covered by what you said before in terms of the document being live, but is there anything you want to add just at this point?
You're right. We set the outline, Damien, out in the plan itself. There is much more work to do now in terms of how we implement a lot of the local interventions that we've set out, and one of them that you've just mentioned. You know, some of it is dependent on funding. Some of it we can do locally and we can start now, and we have a programme of work now to look through and make sure we have a clear implementation plan with actions. And we'd be really keen, and we have obviously during the process spoken to you about it and what is required. Do we need a specific strategy for Black, Asian, minority, ethnic, rather a separated one from, because you're right, at the minute we have included it with the disabilities. So we need to think about whether we need a single standalone strategy, whether we can do it together. But these are conversations that we're going to have now in the coming weeks as we look to implement, you know, the local interventions that we've set out in the recovery plan.
Okay, that's great. I mean, I know people will want to follow up with you on that, Aileen, after the meeting. I don't, unless anybody else wants to wave wildly at me now, I don't have anybody else listed who wants to come in, which is an incredibly efficient use of our time. We're about to save ourselves half an hour here. Get excited. Unless anybody does want to come in, we will leave it there. Just to say a massive thank you to everybody at the Combined Authority, Steve and all your teams, for the hard work that's gone into this, to all of the women that represented by the One Day Project, and to everybody working at the Heseltine Institute, because this meeting is really sort of covering a whole host of discussions, interactions, and research that has fed into what is hopefully going to be a really successful economic strategy. So I would just say thank you to everybody for participating. The list of participants should be on the note of the agenda for the meeting, but if there is anybody who wants to connect up with anybody else who's involved and hasn't met them yet and hasn't fed in, then please do feel free to just send me myself or the Secretariat an email, and we will happily connect people up. Tracy just making a really good point there about digital inclusion, which is definitely something that's picked up in the strategy. So do chat with Aileen or Steve and Lynn and other members of the team there.